Let's talk about the sex-positive movement. What are the pros and cons? What do I think about it as a whole? This video is going to be a bit political. In my opinion, I don't think I can accept the sex-positive movement as a whole. There are parts that are necessary and other parts that are really problematic. And I'm going to explain why I reached that particular conclusion. So first off, if you're not aware, sex positivity is not just a random term. It actually has some sort of relevance as a social movement. People can refer to themselves as, I'm sex positive, or I'm part of the sex positive community. Now what they're referring to is that they believe that sexuality is inherently good, normal, and natural, that it should be celebrated, that we should remove the stigma, particularly the religious stigma and shame associated with sexuality. We should be encouraging sex education. So if you're referring to someone who is sex positive, typically you find that they're quite progressive politically, and they're sort of resisting the traditional limitations that we have placed upon sexuality. Now, maybe you think differently, but for me, I'm actually in favor of this. I think the shame that we have felt around sexuality has done so much damage to our culture. Biologically speaking, we are extremely sexual creatures. We are driven to reproduce. There's really nothing that comes more natural to human than having sex. Your sexuality is such an important part of your identity. So to put guilt and shame or to attack someone's sexuality, you're really attacking the core identity of who they really are. So I don't like that. I also like the fact that there are more sex education in school. However, at the moment, we're doing a really bad job implementing sex education. I think there can be a lot of improvement. But the idea of talking about sex more so we can help destigmatize the shame and guilt around sexuality. We should be able to get to the point where teenage kids growing up in a society where they understand sex, both the physical and the emotional aspects of it. They should feel comfortable reaching out to people to have these difficult conversations so that they don't have to feel embarrassed or shameful. So with that regard, I'm very much in favor of. Unfortunately, I have some issues with the sex positive movement that I just can't agree with. The first one is the celebration of female promiscuity, which I find disgraceful. I just think it does so much damage to young women. The idea that just because men can sleep around as much as they can, let's encourage young girls to do the same and let's call it feminism. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. This really goes to show how we failed our education system. People growing up not knowing the fundamental difference between men and women. What often happens is that you get these young girls who might sleep around with a few men and they feel awful doing it, but they think that their own instinct of revulsion or distaste for what's going on is that there's something wrong with them. So they keep doing it to win the approval of their peers or the culture. But unfortunately, the consequences to their self-esteem are often not felt until later, like when the party ends. You know the feeling of, I have not treasured myself, so how can I expect another man to really treasure me? That is a feeling that is somewhat inevitable given the biology of women, and they're not being educated about that. If a woman was completely informed about the nature of her biology and psychology, what she's likely to feel, how men are going to judge her, and she still decides to do it, that might be one thing. But we're just lying to women at the moment. Telling them, yeah, show your skin, show your ass, have sex with whoever you want, embrace your sexuality, there are no consequences. That's bullshit. There are consequences to their own reputation, their self-esteem, and to the psyche. So I don't like that. The second issue I have about the sex positive movement is about divorce. Let's look at the divorce rate since 1990. Keep in mind that the sexual revolution movement started in 1960. And you can see here since 1960, there has been a huge spike in divorce rate and it stayed relatively high for a while. It started to go down around 2010. And here's the thing, it wasn't that people just stopped getting divorced. No, it was because people stopped getting married. If you don't get married, how can you get divorced, right? So the decline in divorce was also coinciding with a drop in marriage. So millennials are just giving up on marriage completely. They're just cohabitating instead. And this shouldn't be surprising. If everybody is running around having casual sex, there's going to be an increase in infidelity. So of course people are not going to get married anymore. I also have an issue with the glorification of sex work. We have young girls who are no longer interested in pursuing an education. Instead, they want to do sex work. I don't like the fact that OnlyFans has become such a massive thing that young girls are trying to do. I don't think that being a stripper, a actress, or a prostitute is an empowering career. I think only women who have been psychologically damaged or traumatized would ever resort to selling their bodies. I think it does so much damage to a woman to essentially commodify her own body to meet the desires of men. Now, I'm not saying that we need to regulate everybody, telling them what they can or cannot do with their bodies. I just don't like the celebration of it. To me, it's crazy to look at the increase in sex work, and we call that female empowerment. This is something we need to be protecting women from, and I don't think we're protecting women by glorifying sex work. Another problem that comes from the sex positive movement is about the concept of consent. I feel like at this point, nobody knows what consent is anymore because we have diluted and expanded this concept of consent so much that it lost all meanings. Women would go out to the bar, meet a guy, engage in casual sex, wake up the next morning feeling degraded and shameful. So they come to the conclusion that since they feel bad, it must be because there was no consent. You can see how this can lead to a lot of problems. Again, I can make a whole nother video about consent, but this is just something to think about. We have turned this idea of consent into this complicated equation where nobody really knows when consent is happening anymore. The last thing I want to talk about is possibly my most controversial take on this, but I actually have some questions about the psychological health of the BDSM community. I was really curious about this, and I actually did a lot of research on this. You do tend to find that when it comes to sexual fantasies, especially extreme sex kinks, like swinging, fetishes, BDSM, people whipping each other, people degrading each other, as long as it's consensual, it's healthy because people are just acting out their fantasies. While I agree that sexuality is a healthy expression of the human experience, I get worried when you use something sexual as a shield to protect you from any criticisms or any suggestions that the psychology behind it might be problematic. For example, if somebody has a fetish of being humiliated, degraded, peed on, smacked, all kinds of weird stuff like that, right? To me, I'm always curious as to why. Is it possible that something has happened in your childhood? How do you feel about yourself? Do you have low self-esteem? I feel like we should be examining that, and maybe this person needs help. But at the same time, if they were to say, oh, but that's just my sexual kinks, that's just my fetish. Oh, if that's the case, it's off limit. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Just because something is expressed through sexuality doesn't necessarily mean there's no psychological issues to be explored. I think we've seen enough cases of people who used to be really into that kinky stuff, like really aggressive, degradeful, hurtful stuff, to the point where they're bleeding and they found pleasure in it, but then later on overcame the childhood trauma and found that their sexual taste had changed. So I think we need to be more nuanced in our approach to these things. Sexual fantasies can't just be used as a shield against all possible investigation, criticisms, or help. So there you go. That's my take on the sex positive movement. I think there are parts that are necessary, other parts that are problematic. I think that your sexuality is an important part of who you are. It's special, it's beautiful, but there are sensible limitations, especially when it comes to what we label as healthy sexual expressions. Alright, thank you for watching to the end. I know that this is a little bit more controversial, so let me know what you think in the comment section. Until next time, stay curious.